Some movies appear straightforward from the outside. A warm family adventure, a memorable melody, a remarkable car that takes to the skies. Yet the true story behind the creation of Chitty Chitty Bang Bang is anything but straightforward. It runs deep with hidden truths, wrapped in decades of quiet, and packed with choices so daring and outcomes so unforeseen that the film audiences saw represents only part of what actually happened. With more than half a century now past, the complete story deserves to be told properly. And it starts in a place that almost nobody would anticipate. The individual who assembled this entire production was Albert R. Cubby Broccoli, the very same producer who had devoted most of the 1960s to transforming James Bond into the dominant film franchise on Earth. Broccoli had accumulated years of expertise in delivering large-scale visual spectacle, crafting the aesthetic identity of international spy cinema, and producing pictures that consistently felt bigger than anything audiences expected. When he redirected that expertise toward a children's tale about a car with wings, he arrived with every resource and every instinct fully intact. Production designer Ken Adam, the creative force responsible for the vast, theatrical headquarters of Bond villains in Goldfinger and You Only Live Twice, was recruited to construct the entire visual universe of the picture. His gift for imposing spaces and dramatic presentation elevated what could have been a humble family musical into something resembling the most lavishly produced film of its year. Any viewer settling into a cinema seat in 1968 would have had no reason to suspect they were essentially watching a Bond picture with musical numbers woven through it. And yet, in almost every meaningful sense, that is precisely what they were watching. The single largest creative pressure bearing down on every decision made during this production was a film called Mary Poppins. Disney's celebrated 1964 achievement had permanently expanded the idea of what a family musical was capable of doing both artistically and at the box office, and the intention here was stated and unashamed. Produce something equally magnificent, equally treasured, equally resistant to being forgotten. That intention reached into every corner of the production, from the choices made in the casting room to the figures approved in the budget meetings to the selection of the people who would write the songs. Dick Van Dyke, who had appeared alongside Julie Andrews in Poppins, was brought in as the central performer, ensuring that every audience member would draw the connection the moment they saw his name. Richard and Robert Sherman, the brothers who had composed the music for Mary Poppins, were engaged for this project as well, working this time beyond the boundaries of the Disney organization to create songs for a film that made no secret of the standard it was chasing. Their involvement communicated the ambition of the production before a single frame was shot. The question of whether they matched what they had previously accomplished is one that viewers have continued to argue about across the decades that followed. What is beyond dispute is that the music they created gave the film its emotional structure, carrying it from the exuberant physicality of Toot Sweets through the quiet tenderness of Hushabye Mountain, with the title composition ultimately receiving an Academy Award nomination and standing as one of the most enduring pieces the Sherman Brothers produced in any context outside their years at Disney. The script arrived bearing a name that seemed to guarantee the material would be handled with true creative ambition. Roald Dahl had by that point built an international reputation for fiction that operated simultaneously as whimsy and as something considerably darker underneath, stories that carried genuine unease beneath their playful surfaces, and his sensibility appeared to be an ideal match for what the adaptation required. What unfolded during the writing process became one of the most extensively documented sources of unhappiness in the entire production. The material Dahl delivered was progressively reworked, its edges reduced, its instinct for genuine discomfort gradually smoothed away to satisfy the demands that a major commercial family release places on a screenplay. The quality that had made Dahl the right choice for the project, his refusal to let charm exist without something uncomfortable beneath it, was methodically stripped out revision by revision. Once the completed film was in front of audiences, Dahl saw no reason to conceal his feelings about the outcome. He made his dissatisfaction a matter of public record and offered no pretense of connection to what had reached the screen. The tension that produced this outcome is not unusual in the history of large productions. The gap between what a writer intends and what a commercial enterprise requires is a familiar fault line. But the frustration carries a particular weight here, because the film that might have emerged from an uncompromised version of Dahl's vision remains visible in outline, just beneath the surface of the version that actually exists. The original source material survived its transition to cinema in name and basic concept more than in actual content. Fleming's published novel concerning the Potts family and their extraordinary automobile was a compact, unhurried piece of children's fiction, designed to be absorbed in a comfortable chair or beside a lamp at the end of an evening rather than projected onto a screen 60 feet wide. Its essential components were carried across into the production. A family at its center. A car unlike any other. A feeling of the world opening up into something larger. But the invented nation of Bulgaria, the despotic couple who rule it, the concealed population of children living beneath its streets, everything that occupies the latter portion of the running time, carries no trace of Fleming's authorship because Fleming never wrote any of it. Roles of real significance were constructed for characters who do not appear anywhere in the book. Complete sequences were built from the ground up to satisfy the demands of a film that needed to fill the runtime of a prestige roadshow release. The result is a picture that borrows its name and its central vehicle from a specific published work while functioning as something substantially self-contained. Fleming's book is a quiet, brief thing with a light touch. The film carrying its name runs for 2.5 hours and has developed its own internal world, its own invented threats, and its own distinct way of operating. The distance between them is wide enough that experiencing one after the other feels less like adaptation and more like encountering two entirely separate imaginations that happen to begin from the same single idea. There is one element of this story that cannot be approached indirectly. The child catcher exists in no version of Fleming's text. There is not the faintest suggestion of him anywhere in the published pages. He was conceived entirely for the filmed version, and the widely held attribution for that invention points to Roald Dahl in the course of the scripting work, which carries its own considerable irony, given that almost everything else Dahl contributed was subsequently altered beyond recognition. The character he brought into existence proved more durable than any other element of his involvement. Robert Helpman, who portrayed the figure on screen, had constructed one of the most distinguished careers in 20th century ballet before arriving on this production, and every year of that training was present in how he inhabited the role. Helpman had spent decades learning to make a body communicate precisely what words could not, to translate internal states into physical expression with complete accuracy. Applied to a character designed to generate fear, that skill produced something that operated in a register fundamentally different from the broadly comedic antagonists surrounding it. The extended nose. The enveloping dark clothing. The offers of confections delivered in a voice calibrated to sound reassuring. Reports from the original theatrical run included accounts of children who would not agree to go back inside a cinema. Across every subsequent generation that has encountered the film, the character occurs as the central image of childhood dread. The invention that Dahl produced to create narrative tension in a screenplay ultimately became the defining emotional fact of the entire picture. The most consequential contribution to the story was also the contribution that was never part of the story at all. Running parallel to the visible narrative was a layer of illusion that operated entirely beneath conscious awareness. Grandpa Potts, shuffling and eccentric and seemingly ancient, read to every viewer as someone separated from his inventor son by a span of comfortable decades. The cosmetic work was precise. The physical performance was total. The possibility that something was being constructed rather than simply recorded did not occur to viewers then, and does not occur to most viewers now. What was actually being constructed was an age gap that ran in the opposite direction from the one on screen. Lionel Jeffries, who played the grandfather, was younger than Dick Van Dyke, who played his son. Van Dyke was in the early portion of his 40s during production. Jeffries had not yet left his 30s. The convincing impression of advanced age was assembled entirely from wardrobe decisions, careful cosmetic application, and a performance grounded completely in physical vocabulary. The movement pattern suggesting a body that had gradually stopped cooperating. The quality of attention implying a consciousness that had found its own preferred distance from the immediate present. Not a single moment in the completed film allows the construction to become visible. Viewers who watched it upon release accepted it without question. Viewers who discover it now are equally untroubled by it. It represents one of the quieter and more complete demonstrations of what physical performance and production craft can produce together when each is being executed without compromise. Capturing the musical sequences on film demanded technical responses that the available equipment of the period had simply never been required to provide. The fundamental problem was acoustic. When filming musical performance in outdoor locations at scale, the playback systems standard to late 1960s production were not capable of distributing recorded music clearly enough across the area involved for every performer to maintain reliable synchronization. Wind, space, and ambient interference combined to make it genuinely difficult for dancers and extras at a distance from the speakers to hear what they were meant to be performing to. The answer required designing and deploying arrays of speakers across the filming area, positioned with enough care and coverage that the music reached every individual regardless of where within the staging they happened to be standing or how far from the camera the action extended. The audience watching these scenes receives Dick Van Dyke moving with apparent effortlessness and a cast of hundreds operating as a single unified organism. What the audience has no way of seeing is the acoustic infrastructure that made every beat of that unison achievable. The most spectacular moments in a musical production are supported by technical solutions that exist precisely, so they will never be noticed. Certain sequences demanded a level of environmental control that went well beyond what most productions would consider feasible. Within specific filming locations, trees were repainted. Not represented by painted backdrops or replaced with constructed alternatives, but physically altered, their actual coloring adjusted to conform to the palette the visual design required. Props throughout were modified. Surfaces were treated. Every object the camera would encounter was approached as something that either served the visual intention or required adjustment until it did. The consequence of this systematic control was imagery that carried the quality of illustration rather than documentation, frames that appeared to have been designed rather than simply recorded. For a production whose central purpose was to create a sustained experience of fantasy, the decision to exert this degree of control over real physical environments rather than accepting them as given was not excessive. It was the logical extension of the philosophy that drove every other visual decision. The atmosphere of warmth and storybook unreality that viewers describe when they recall those sequences was not a spontaneous product of the locations. It was built deliberately and at some effort, one adjusted element at a time. A leg injury sustained by Dick Van Dyke partway through the shoot sent disruption moving through the production schedule in every direction simultaneously. Any scene that placed physical demands on the lead performer, any sequence requiring dance, sustained movement, or extended physical performance had to be deferred or restructured. The entire organization of the remaining shoot was rebuilt around the realistic limitations of Van Dyke's recovery at each successive stage, which meant departing from the planned sequence of filming and managing all the complications that departure introduces into a large production. The response involved extended working periods maintained over a significant stretch of weeks in order to absorb the time that had been lost and preserve the delivery commitments already in place. Nothing of this is legible in the completed film. The performance carries no inconsistency. The physical demands placed on the lead show no variation in quality. The total absence of visible disruption in what reached the screen is a production achievement that has received almost no acknowledgement in the years since. The car at the center of everything was not a single object. It was 6. Each of the 6 was engineered to meet a distinct set of functional requirements that could not have been satisfied by any one vehicle. The version used for road sequences was a working automobile, constructed to operate on real surfaces under real conditions. The versions used for flying sequences were built to be suspended and photographed against controlled backgrounds, with no requirement that they function as vehicles at all. The versions used in water were designed and ballasted to float rather than to move under their own power. Each carried a specification driven entirely by what the scenes it would appear in actually required. The challenge that ran through the construction of all 6 was the demand for absolute visual consistency. The distinctive wing forms, the particular character of the brass detailing, the overall impression of an elegant mechanical object that had quietly exceeded its original nature, all of it had to be precisely identical across objects built to completely different standards for completely different purposes. that the overwhelming majority of the audience for this film has never suspected that more than one car existed constitutes the most direct evidence available that this particular challenge was resolved completely. The sequences in which the car actually moves through the air were the domain of John Steers, a figure whose record in British film effects placed him at the center of the most technically demanding work being produced in the industry at that moment. The Bond productions had established his particular value, his capacity to identify workable approaches to problems that had no precedent, and to build functional things that had never existed because the films he was working on required them to exist. Translating that capacity to the specific challenge of making a large automobile appear to sustain flight across an extended portion of a feature film, rather than simply in a single brief shot, required everything he had developed across his career to that point. The approach he and his team constructed drew on rigging at scale, photographic control, and the compositing methods available in that period. What emerged from that process carried an unintended visual quality that turned out to be a significant asset. The characteristic appearance of optical compositing from this era, the faint luminous boundary that accumulates at the edge where separately filmed elements are combined, produced exactly the visual register associated with high-quality illustrated children's fiction. A winged car moving across sky, surrounded by that soft, inherent glow, occupied a space between documented reality and drawn image that suited the material precisely. Whether this was a conclusion that anyone reached deliberately or simply a fortunate meeting of technical artifact and appropriate context is not possible to determine with confidence. The result was that the visible imperfection became a form of accuracy. Steers subsequently directed effects work on the original Star Wars production. What he contributed to this film was an early and clear demonstration of the instincts that would take him there. The photographic format chosen for the production was 70mm large format, a decision that placed this family musical in direct technical company with Lawrence of Arabia, 2001, A Space Odyssey, and the most formally ambitious pictures of the decade. Each frame held substantially more visual information than standard formats permitted. Color registered with greater depth and range. Detail resolved at a level that projected onto the large screens of prestige engagements with unmistakable clarity. The sweeping pastoral landscapes of England, the constructed interior spaces, the sequences involving large numbers of performers all required a format capable of holding their full scale without reduction. The choice communicated something specific about how the people responsible for the production understood what they were making. The domestic spaces attributed to the scrumptious family were created within Pinewood Studios in Buckinghamshire, the same working facility that had served as the primary home of Bond production throughout that era. The sequences set within the Kingdom of Bulgaria drew on real locations across Europe, with Neuschwanstein Castle in Bavaria providing the exterior imagery that anchored the entire invented nation visually. Its profile against mountain and forest carried the kind of authority that purpose-built construction cannot achieve regardless of what is spent on it. The weight and age of actual stone, the particular quality of light on surfaces that have been standing for centuries, registered differently than fabricated equivalents. The contrast in feeling between the warmth of the English sequences and the cold formality of the European locations did work in establishing Bulgaria as a place genuinely distinct from everything the